This week on Thinking Biblically, we're featuring the first of two special end-of-the-year replays. But first, I have a bunch of things that I'd love to talk to you about. Welcome back to Thinking Biblically. My name is Alan Gilman. This is the 27th weekly edition of Thinking Biblically. We started back in June, middle of June, and been so blessed by the guests who've been willing to come on, the conversations that we've had, and the encouragement that I've received from many of you. If you didn't catch last week, we were talking about my son Josh's new children's illustrated book, The King's Daughter, and how this expresses the value that is intrinsic in all human beings, and because we were made in the image of God. And we're actually talking about the tragedy of abuse. And as we had our conversation, it became more and more clear how it was the loss of human dignity and value that plays such a part in the perpetration of this horrible thing, and how it affects both the victims and the perpetrators. And so anyway, if you didn't have a chance to see that, I encourage you to do so. Speaking of illustrated children's books, I do want to also mention that this just came out by my wife, Robin. It's illustrated by the real Daniel's, it's called Daniel's Dilemma. It's by the real Daniel's wife, Alexandra. It's a story that my wife wrote 29 years ago, and it's been a long time in coming. It was not planned that these two books by my wife and by my son would come out around the same time. But I wanted to bring this to your attention. It's available now fully on the American Amazon, and it's beginning to emerge on the Canadian one. If you see it for $70 odd, that's not the one to get. It looks like somebody's purchasing the American version and selling it, but it's beginning to appear. It's possible that by the time you watch this, it'll be available. It should be around $25, $26 Canadian. It's about $20 US. I'll put some links in the description below. Robin's going to come on the podcast, God willing, the second week in January. We'll talk a little bit about the book, but we're mainly going to be looking at and discussing her own faith journey. Maybe you've seen mine already. That's available in video. I'll put the link to that too, if I remember. But one of the things about our stories is, on one hand, she and I have so many things in common. We grew up in the same part of Montreal. We went to the same public school. We went to the same candy store. We went to the same Yiddish school together to learn the Jewish language Yiddish. And so we have a lot of commonality in our backgrounds. But at the same time, our faith stories are very, very different. Of course, there are some things that are, the essentials are the same, but very, very different. You'll hear more when she comes on in less than a month's time. And so that's something to look forward to. We have some other upcoming guests that I'm excited to tell you about, some people coming back and some new ones. Michael Gertzman from Israel will be back to continue his story. He shared his faith journey with us some weeks ago. And there were some things that he started talking about near the end that I want to follow up on. Especially about how God called him and his wife to immigrate to Israel. And there were some other things about some of the things that he's done there that really fit in well with what Thinking Biblically is all about. So we'll be talking about that. I'm also going to be welcoming back Dr. Ian Provan, the Regent Professor, biblical scholar, and we're going to be talking about the very important topic of the inspiration of Scripture. And then, remember, Aaron Aimi was here some weeks ago. He works with CMJ Israel. Well, the new director of CMJ Canada, Melody Grey Eyes, will be here, and she has a fascinating story. Melody is an Indigenous woman whom God has given a great burden, a great heart for the Jewish people. So we'll be hearing her story about that. Dr. Rod Wilson, one of my first guests, will be back, and he's going to be discussing his latest book. And through the weeks and weeks of the podcast, we have been communicating back and forth, and he's been kind of pushing me on what Thinking Biblically is all about. And so hopefully we'll be touching on that when he's back on the show. And then another Regent Professor, But middle of February, Dr. Paul Spilsbury, who's an expert on the book of Revelation, will be on, and we're going to be talking about the book of Revelation. And so that's going to be fun. But today I want to introduce or reintroduce the late Dr. David Friedman to you. David was my very first interview guest on the show. So when we started, I had my son Daniel on as a guest host, and he's been on since then a couple of times. Look forward to having him back at some point. But Dr. David Friedman was my very first interview guest, all the way from Israel, and just sharing some of his story and his insights. I'll be putting information about his books in the description. And so this interview goes back to June the 23rd, and sadly, David passed away in early September. Today, I have with me Dr. David Friedman. David was raised in Minnesota and currently lives near Jerusalem. He is the former academic dean and professor of Jewish studies at King of Kings College in Jerusalem. Currently, he lectures internationally on biblical topics as well as on the history of the modern state of Israel. He's a former member of the Israeli Defense Forces, as a lot of Israelis are. He also works actively in the area of Jewish-Arab reconciliation as a speaker and mentor, and is an advocate for a secure state of Israel. He also serves as the secretary of the Israeli political party Gush HaTanachi, which means the Bible bloc. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about that after. David is the writer of several books, including, and all these are available on Amazon, They Loved the Torah, What Yeshua's First Followers Really Thought About the Law, Sudden Terror, Exposing Militant Islam's War Against the United States and Israel, At the Feet of Rabbi Gamaliel, Rabbinic Influence in Paul's Teachings, and Shemot, a translation and commentary to the book of Exodus. David is currently working on a new book providing a summary of the recent rocket attacks, which is what we're going to be talking about in a couple of minutes. But first, I'd like to mention how we met. And so I was actually the baseball chapel leader of a professional baseball team here in Ottawa, where I live. That was a few years ago. And upon hearing that I was doing that, a mutual friend of ours, who my family and I met originally in Vancouver. She was from Minnesota originally, and she contacted me and said, "You need to meet David Friedman." So I reached out to David because of some sort of baseball connection, and it turns out that David has quite that baseball connection. Instead of me explaining what that is, why don't we just take a few moments? David, can you tell us about the baseball part of your life?
Well, as a kid, I fell in love with baseball, I don't know, at age 6 or 7. I couldn't get enough of it. My summers were pretty much spent following the ball. We played every day with my friends. And as a grown-up, as an adult, I began to get involved back in baseball coaching. As my sons were growing up, I coached them both, and then had the opportunity to coach both high school and then NCAA baseball at the Division III level, which I did in 2007 and 8 while on sabbatical in the U.S. Coached as a coach on 4 of Israel's national baseball teams. I was involved in the beginning of baseball here in Israel. And I ended up being an international scout for 8 years for this baseball Cincinnati Reds, which was a wonderful gig, very part-time, but took me to some corners in the world I never thought I'd get to.
Yeah, actually, when I learned that, I looked it up, and there's probably people could still find it. There's a Jerusalem Post article about your trip to Uganda scouting baseball players for the Cincinnati Reds.
Right. That was an amazing experience.
Yeah, and a lot of people, including Israelis, get surprised when we connect baseball with Israel at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I know that there's a couple of baseball fields in the country.
I think there's one that's an actual baseball field. Others are soccer fields that have been fixed up. There's another one being built, I think. It's been about a 5 or 6 year long project so far. That's not done yet. But yes, So there are those fields. Otherwise, like my sons did, they grew up playing here in Israel on soccer fields that we could rent.
Right. I was so surprised myself to see that there was any baseball at all in Israel, and then it was such a delight to then meet you and find out that you were involved in these early beginnings uh,
Mhm.
with the sport there. And I know it's the Israel Baseball Federation, whatever it is. There's a motto that says where traditions meet, and you. For those of you, if you need to know about both Israel and baseball to understand the meaning of such a statement. And so
Right.
maybe this is a subject we'll come back some other time. But now why don't we get into the subject at hand, where you've graciously accepted my invitation to come on and talk about Israel and the Middle East. And as we mentioned before we started, you could take us wherever you want to take us, David, to help
Sure.
our viewers and listeners make sense out of what's going on, give as much historical background that you think is necessary. I know it could actually take hours to do, but as briefly as possible, try to give us context and help us to understand what in the world has been going on there.
Okay. Well, maybe what I'd like to focus on is what's going on here right now, since people listen to the news, and I don't know how much and how good of sources that you can get in the West these days. But all of you know that in the past month, Israel's been through pretty much what constituted a war. I guess wherever you have two people shooting at each other, you have a war. We had over 4,000 rockets launched at the western Negev towns, at the cities in the central area of Israel, with a couple of attempts at northern cities. Um, and this is an ongoing situation in Israel. It never really stops. There are times when it gets worse than others on our western border with the Gaza Strip and the Hamas organization there, which is a terrorist organization that has an ironclad rule over that area. If you look at Hamas's charter, which was written in 1988, you'll see it's written in there basically that Hamas wants to see Jewish people out of Israel and all of us basically die. So they're not going to be an entity that you can negotiate with or really ever have any peace with. Unfortunately, I think in the past month, they have really flexed their muscles amongst the Arab population in Israel. So, in other words, during the rocketing war, Hamas knew it wasn't going to beat Israel militarily with the rockets. It wasn't going to stop Israel from existing. It just spread a little terror for a while. They suffered an incredible damage to their infrastructure, Hamas did. However, they had a kind of a victory, which was that they got the respect of the Arab street. And as you know, the Palestinian Authority, which runs pretty much affairs for Palestinians, um, is headed by someone named Mahmoud Abbas, a former terrorist himself with the PLO. And Abbas right now is not very popular. Hamas is trying to wrest, as it were, the power in the Palestinian Authority from him, even though Hamas really is the larger of the two wings that make up the Palestinian Authority. And so I think they've made progress, Hamas has, in doing that in the past month by causing this war and in basically trying to tell Palestinians that Hamas represents them and not the Fatah wing of the Palestinian Authority, which is Abbas, the wing that he heads up. So
I
that's
wondered,
going
David,
on.
could you
Yes.
explain a little bit? Um, there's the territories, there's the uh, that it's overseen, ruled by Palestinians, and you mentioned about Fatah, and then there's Hamas. But then there's the Arab peoples living in Israel proper. And I
Right.
wonder, can you explain that a little bit for us? Like, what's the
Sure.
difference, and what are the implications of some of this?
Absolutely. So there's basically, it's really a strange phenomenon, but we have Arabs who are not citizens of the state of Israel, but would consider themselves subjects of the Palestinian Authority who live outside of the state of Israel. And actually, right on our borders, many of them work in Israel. In fact, in our town, we have over 400 such Palestinians from villages. And what's defined as the Palestinian Authority areas, so they're not Israeli citizens who work in our town. So there's a difference between those Palestinians and people who are Israeli Arabs. Sometimes they call themselves Palestinians too. but an Israeli Arab has citizenship in the state of Israel and will typically be from somewhere like Jerusalem or Haifa or Akko, or Jaffa, which are areas that have a large Arab population to them. Uh, if you're an Arab Israeli, so you have citizenship in Israel, you're able to vote in Israel, you are able to get healthcare here, the same services that I get. You can go to hospitals in Israel, your educational system is in Israel, and you can worship freely in Israel. So the lives are quite different between Palestinians living in the PA areas and Arab Israeli citizens. And this is so what happens is that the Palestinian Authority runs the areas that are called the Palestinian Authority areas, obviously. So, in other words, they're the government per se for the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians who live outside of the borders of the state of Israel. The government for
This is something I wasn't even clear on it. So you're saying there are Arab people who live in Israel proper.
Yes.
That may not even be the best term, but so not in the territories, which we often call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Right. There are Arabs living in Israel who see themselves as being under the Palestinian Authority?
I wouldn't say under the Palestinian Authority. In fact, they wouldn't want to be, because the government's much better in Israel as far as giving them opportunity to live a productive life. No. What it is the Palestinians who live outside the borders of Israel, who are under the Palestinian Authority, have to look to the Palestinian Authority to provide for them as the government would. Right. Whereas Israeli Arabs would look to Israel's government to provide for them as a typical government would. And their citizenship is Israeli, whereas a Palestinian, his citizenship is kind of up in the air at this point. They do have Palestinian identity cards. Some of them even carry Israeli identity cards. I don't know how. Others have Jordanian ones, but they don't live in Jordan. So it's a very complicated situation.
Now, what you did say, though, one of the differences that happened over this most recent conflict is how Hamas somehow has connected more with Arabs living in Israel.
Yes.
So can you explain that a little further?
Yes. All of you may be aware that during the time of the rocketing war, short of those 2 weeks, there was some widespread rioting in the cities of Jaffa and, of course, in Jerusalem and in Ramla. And these are three areas that have a good-sized Israeli Arab population. They were listening to Hamas's what I call provocation. And a lot of the youths, especially from the millennial generation, kind of ate up what Hamas was telling them, took to the streets. And we had a lot of riots and violence. We had 5 synagogues burned.
And that's all new. That kind of phenomenon wasn't
on that scale. It's never happened before. I can't recall a time in my 40 years here where that's happened. No.
Now you mentioned right at the beginning something along the lines of you live with this all the time, but so are you able to explain what it's like to live with the ongoing tension and how that's different from what happened last month?
Sure. Ongoing tension is something that is present here every single day, even when things are good. You know, I have a feeling that if Israeli citizens and Arab citizens inside Israel, even Palestinians outside of our borders, didn't have the kind of government situation that we have in politics that we have, that we could live together. I really do. However, that's not what is afforded here. The PA is teaching their children to hate Jews. Hamas obviously is the ruling wing of the PA, is taking part in that and even going above and beyond what Fatah does. So there's always this teaching going on amongst the Arab population that Jews don't belong in the land of Israel. And that's underlying all the time. You don't know how many Arab citizens of Israel believe that. You don't know how many Palestinians believe that. You don't know how it affects them. And obviously you don't go around asking. So that tension is always there. We had a young man in our synagogue who came to some of us older people in the synagogue one day in tears, and he said, every time I get on a bus, every Arab, and Arabs can use our bus system with no problem. We have Arab bus drivers, in fact. And every Arab he passed on the bus, he said, would just stare at me with hatred. And he said, I don't know what to do. I don't hate Arabs, and I want to live at peace. I don't want to get on a bus and feel like there's daggers coming at me all the time. So he was just picking up the tension that there is.
Now,
No, I don't.
would you say that animosity from Arabs towards Jews is like, how prevalent is that from your experience? I should have asked you right at the beginning, how long have you been living in Israel?
40 years.
Okay, so that's a good biblical number.
It's a good chunk.
Yeah. Okay, so you're quite experienced. So how much goodwill or lack thereof is there between Arabs and Jews generally? And is it a matter of like depends where you live, or is that young man's experience just the way it is?
I think there are areas that are better than others, and I think there are also some Arab families that are more inclined to be able to live side by side with Jews than others. And I also think that it just depends on, yeah, what the climate's like at the moment. So in other words, a lot of those Arab youths who were rioting a month ago probably are settled back down in their regular life now and don't go around stabbing Jews every day. It's just it was Ramadan, passions were stoked. There were a couple of situations in the politics here that were unresolved between Jews and Arabs here in the land of Israel that just gave way to what was going on. Again, Alan, I think that most Arab families that I know, that I meet, would be happy, who live in Israel, are happy to live in Israel at peace with Jews. What gets happened is we have these times of when provocation takes place. We have sensitive times of the year. We have things happening on the Temple Mount. And when there's a problem on the Temple Mount, passions just get inflamed. And there's no reasoning with these kinds of emotions. You can't reason with a mob, so to speak. So that happens. And it happens on just a regular kind of cycle. You can almost predict when it's going to happen. There are declared days of rage by the Palestinian Authority where they encourage people to take to the streets and throw rocks at Jewish cars and burn tires in their Arab villages. And, they announce the date ahead of time. So on those days, you're going to expect problems. But generally speaking, I'm more optimistic, I guess. I think if there wasn't that kind of provocation, and if the educational system and the Palestinian Authority would teach tolerance, I think the great majority of Arab citizens would be happy to live at peace with their Jewish neighbors. In fact, on a daily basis, when I walk in Jerusalem, that's what I see. I see Arab families going out in their shopping malls, strolling with their babies with Jewish families, and there's no animosity that you see between people. You have Arab waiters and waitresses serving Jews and vice versa. In our hospitals, I had an Arab doctor do a procedure on me with his Jewish nurse a few years back. There's no animosity. But then we hit times when simply it just all seems to come to a head.
Yeah, this is something that this is one of the reasons why I like to bring people to Israel, for them to actually see what it's like. I know for myself, I've only been there 3 times. I hope that number goes up. But I would be struck by how normal life was, because we're so affected by the media lens on the situation that when you actually get there, and whether it's all the various interactions and the restaurants and the kids going to school and the kids playing, and it's like, wait a second, this looks like, like the good part of North American life. Like, what's going on here? It's supposed to be disaster all the time. Now, then you do get reminded. I've been to is it Safad? Is that the right name? Where the bus shelters are also bomb shelters because they're very close to Gaza. Right. And so on one hand, it's normal. On the other hand, there's this sense of always having to be ready for the next thing. And my heart goes out to you that you have to live with that kind of tension all the time.
It's definitely there, and Israelis for the most part, are always aware of our surroundings. So you'll find this is kind of a funny phenomenon, but I find myself when I go into a restaurant, I always want to sit in the back corner where I can look and see who's coming in. That's very much a security kind of thing that's just been drilled into me. So when I go to the States, people say, you want to sit here? And I say, no, I want to sit there facing the doorway. Not that you could do anything. Yeah, that tension is there. And I think, especially as a Messianic Jew, I don't want to hate people who hate me. But on the same hand, living here so long, I do realize that you have to stand up for your right to live in your nation. And if you don't do that, there are people who would be very happy to revoke that violently from me. My son lives in Jerusalem. Oh, 5, 6 blocks away from him is an Arab village. He can't walk in there. His family can't walk in there. They won't come out alive. So you have to know which particular Arab towns are not friendly to Jews and which are. And there are differences. Arab Christian villages tend to be much friendlier. And there are Bedouin encampments and Bedouin villages generally are okay. But if Muslim villages, you just have to know which ones are high security and which ones are not a security risk.
Yeah. So this complex version of what's really going on there, what it's like to live there. This is one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, Thinking Biblically, because a biblical, in my understanding, a biblical understanding of life is to reckon with its complexities, its nuances, its ambiguities. And not only the media, but now people, everything's been reduced to this kind of, I call it a soundbite culture. And you cannot talk about these truths, these realities in sound bites. It's absolutely impossible. Trying to do it then skews what the reality really is.
Yeah.
So, even in our conversation, how much can we actually cover? But I did want to ask, is, in your opinion, and you're involved to some extent in the political realm in Israel, is there anything, in your opinion, that Israel could do apart from, who's right, who's wrong, and all the rest? What I've been seeing is more and more everyone wants to put the responsibility all on Israel. And then, my reaction is to kind of push back from that. But is there anything that Israel could be doing that could help make the situation better?
Do you mean as far as our relationship with the rest of the world or with the Arab population around us, or both?
Well, yeah, primarily the situation on the ground in Israel.
Okay.
You yourself have said there could, you hope for peace and
yeah.
Right. So how?
I sometimes throw my hands up at that question, Alan. I don't know. I mean, obviously, Israel can be more compassionate as a people, but we really do try. I see attempts at that, like the Save a Child's Heart program, which is
Why don't you explain that? A lot of people aren't aware of what that is.
That's just one program out of many. In that particular program, there is really doctors. Ami Cohen, who was involved in Israeli baseball's founding, was one of them. He founded this organization. And what they do is they treat Palestinian and Arab, along with other Middle Eastern nations and African nations, pediatric cardiac patients. So they take children, doesn't matter what their background is. They don't charge them a penny. They do whatever cardiac operation that the child can't get in his own country for free in Israel. The child is hospitalized for free, treated for free, recovered for free here, and then is sent home after. And of course, his family is hosted by that hospital and its staff of doctors while the child's here. There have been over 1,000 Palestinian cardiac patients treated by that program alone. So
why would Israel do that? Like why?
There's a lot of compassion here. There really is. And it's an impressive thing to see our people having gone through the Shoah not long ago, the Holocaust.
Which is, for those who don't, the Shoah is the Hebrew word for the Holocaust.
Yeah, the Holocaust. And having 4 declared wars, and then this tension continually going on with continual terror attacks and continual shedding of blood of some sort. Still, there are so many Israelis who want to do good in this world and want to give good to those who who are in need of it, no matter what their ethnic background is. Did you know that Israel was the first nation in the world to take in Bosnian refugees during the conflict there? I don't know if it was 30 some years ago.
Yeah,
So
I've heard of. I don't
they
know
were
if
all
I was aware
Muslims.
of that one. I know it was. Israel was the first to be on the ground in Haiti after the Haitian earthquake. Israel's done these remarkable things.
Yeah, we have, and that impresses me. And I want to believe that that represents the heart and soul of our people. Now, can we do things better? Well, of course we can. There's always opportunities to have better relations than we do. But honestly, for what we're going through as a people and as a nation, my hat goes off to this nation. It's really been a shining example in many ways of typical of behavior that you just won't see. I mean, one of the things I like to do is build a scenario for people what it's like living here with where they live. I'll do that for you just a second here. It'll take a minute, but it's worth it. And I said to myself, no other nation in the world would act the way Israel does. For example, with what's going on in the Gaza Strip, you live in Ontario. I'm going to bring you to Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario. Let's say Ontario and the state of Michigan are having a war. And across the bay there is shelling and rockets and bombing and shooting. And the entire port authority of both cities has to close down. Now, if you're living in Windsor, what would it be like for you if the media in Detroit talks about how at the first opportunity they're going to march into Windsor and cut all your heads off and rape your daughters and wives and burn down your town, and they're serious about it. And if you're not defending yourself, that is what's going to happen, because you can see in Detroit, there's this huge military buildup of military there, and they're shooting artillery across the bay, et cetera, et cetera. What if that happened at least once a year for a 10-day period, the shooting across the bay, but the media assault was constant? And what if there were people from Michigan coming into Windsor all the time and going all the way to London, Ontario, trying to carry out terror attacks? That is what it's like living here. That kind of thing is
Yeah.
happening all the time.
And
And
I think
so,
that's part of the narrative that a lot of people outside of Israel don't really understand. And so I was just watching just yesterday, getting a little prepared for our time, a video by the Wall Street Journal about some of the destruction that happened over the rocket attacks was posted there. And it fed the narrative that, yes, Hamas was sending indiscriminate rockets towards civilian areas, and it did cause some damage. But look what Israel did in attacking these high-rise buildings and all this destruction. The people died, and when Israel first started as a nation in 1948, it was a David and Goliath story, and Israel was the David. But it wasn't. Now Israel's seen as the Goliath that is just flexing its muscle. These poor, oppressed Palestinian people are frustrated, and so they're acting out in trying to do whatever they can to get the world's attention and all the rest. And then big, powerful Israel comes in and just bashes them to pieces. And so then all the responsibility is put on Israel for being so, oppressive upon the Arabs. But what you've just said is giving the why Israel has to take such a strong stand, because the people attacking Israel actually want to do far more than just indiscriminately send rockets.
read the Hamas charter. They want to commit genocide here. They're sworn to it.
And
Here's
a lot of
another
people,
fact.
I don't think they're willing to accept that they mean what they're saying.
Well,
Yeah.
when Hamas was born in 1987, I happened to be in the army on the Gaza Strip, and I got to see with my own eyes Hamas operatives holding, I don't know, I'm going to guess a year-old children in front of them as they were attacking the police at that time with rocks and bricks and knives and even zip guns. I mean, what kind of person does that? That is child abuse. And it really shows the intent of Hamas. They don't care who gets hurt. They have their political aims, and come hell or high water, they're going to achieve them, is what they're trying to portray. Here's another fact. If Israel was really targeting civilians, then we're the worst military ever in the history of the world, because I'm sorry about the fact that 260 civilians in Gaza died, but when there's millions of people there, and if we were targeting civilians and that's your toll, that's pretty bad, if you get what I'm saying.
I think
We
that's
were,
really hard for the average, media consumer to actually get that, because it's all they could see is the tragedy of the over 200 civilians. But that actually makes a lot of sense what you're saying. If Israel actually did want to do what people are saying they want to do,
right.
it could have been would have been a lot worse. So how
Right.
do you answer this charge of Israel's an apartheid state? What do you
That's
say?
absolutely ridiculous. And let me tell you that I have a friend in South Africa who laughs and laughs when he hears it. He's older than me. He grew up in apartheid South Africa, and he's visited
But
Israel. He wrote it.
Desmond Tutu himself has said
I
that.
know he did, yeah. But this young man, not so young, but he wrote the introduction to my book, Will the Nazi Eagle Rise Again? That's another book I wrote. And he, in his introduction, which is about a page or so long, he takes apart the idea that Israel's an apartheid state. As a Black South African, he would know. Okay, here's what I say, Alan. In South Africa, in the Union of South Africa apartheid, Blacks and whites couldn't socialize. In Israel, as you've seen with your own eyes, Israelis and Arabs are socializing. Secondly, Arabs take part in regular life in Israel. Arabs can, as I say, a good number of doctors and nurses in our hospitals are Arabs, and they are hospitalized and are treated in our hospitals. That didn't take place in the Union of South Africa. Union of South Africa, white people, black people could not use the beach together. They were segregated. In Israel, our beaches are not segregated. In our professional soccer league, we have a number of teams that have Arabs playing in them. We even have an Arab team from the town of Saknin. In the Republic of South Africa, none of that took place. There was no athletic competition between Black South Africans and white
Okay,
South
so
Africans.
you're making it sound like it's a nonsense claim.
Oh,
Then
absolutely.
then why is anybody saying this?
Because emotions connect up to that image. It's an image, a false image, as my South African friend Luba says. It's a false image. Kenneth Misho, the parliament member in today's Republic of South Africa, a black member, will say the same thing. This is absolutely ridiculous. And it's done in order to catch the emotion, especially of young adults, because young adults, I don't want to come down on young adults. I'm a father of a couple of them, but young adults often don't check out the background of what they're told. They're told something, it strikes an emotional chord. It must be true, and therefore those Jews are have an apartheid state. We do not. You want to
Okay.
see an apartheid
Yeah.
state? Go to neighboring Saudi Arabia. There you'll see one. You want to see another apartheid state? Go to neighboring Jordan. You'll see one. There's not one Jew who lives in either of those two countries. We're banned from doing so. What do you call that? But nobody will say a thing about that.
Right, right. With some of the time we have remaining, or all the time I have remaining, can you share with us, explain to us outside the land, what's just happened politically? There was all these elections, one after the
Yeah.
other, and finally there's been a changing of the guard, so to speak. Can you, yeah,
Sure.
unpack that
Well,
for us?
as everyone knows, we just had elections for, I guess, the third time in the past 2 years. I, by the way, was a candidate in those elections. I didn't win. But anyhow, Naftali Bennett was elected as our prime minister. Well, I can't even say he was elected as our prime minister. He became prime minister through the working of the coalition system. We're after the British parliamentary system and the way that elections operate. So you're voting for a party. Bennett's party did not get the majority of mandates that there are. But when basically Bibi Netanyahu was our prime minister for 12 straight years, his fractured, and then in the negotiations that took place afterwards between the people who the media would call on the right side of politics, they came together and they got some coalition members to join them from the left side of Israeli politics, namely Yair Lapid, and then even a pro-Muslim Brotherhood party head by the name of Mansour Abbas, who brought some mandates with him from Arab votes, and those three got together and were able to get enough people to back them. And of course, Bennett was going to be the prime minister in that scenario, with Lapid scheduled in another 2 years, I think, to have a rotation of the prime minister, which you can do by Israeli law. So we're going to have Bennett for 2 years, Lapid for a little under 2 years afterwards, before the next elections. So
this whole system is very foreign. So in Canada here, we also have the British parliamentary system. Right. And we vote for a party, and then the head of that party that gets most votes. If the party gets most votes, then that's the prime minister, the head of that party. But Israel, you've got this system that many Canadians thought we should switch to, which is proportional representation.
Right.
And it results in this plethora of parties, and all sorts of parties getting all sorts of votes. And you've never had in your history a true majority government where one party by itself ever got a majority of votes. Isn't that correct?
We did once. And I think 1996, I believe it was, we had a direct prime ministerial election. Netanyahu ran against Perez.
Like the American system.
Yes.
And that's how you got the prime minister. But in terms of the governing house, the legislature in Israel called the Knesset, right. We call it the parliament here in Canada. Right. You've never had a party that had 50% plus one of the vote ever.
No.
Right. So there's like a party that's gotten a lot of the vote. It's always been around like 35%. And that would be a really good showing. And then what happens is they start to court other parties to build a coalition. They wheel and deal
together. Correct. Yes.
Right. And so you end up with a very kind of interesting collection of interests in the government. Yeah. Correct?
Definitely you do. And
it was around that point that David's internet connection completely cut out. And so it took us a couple minutes to get reconnected. And then we picked up the conversation where it left off. And David's using a different device at this point.
Well, anyhow, what I was saying was that it's very difficult to get much done with the new government that we have. And I think everybody is a little bit concerned about that because, we need to pass a budget to get the government operating with any of our social services like healthcare and education. The problem being that there are so many interests represented by so many different parties, and some of those contradict each other. Like, I really don't know how the security situation is going to be discussed and acted upon in terms of budget, whatever, with a pro-Muslim Brotherhood party in the mix with a pretty large voice. It'll be interesting to see because they are not particularly big on spending money on securing their state for some reason. So we have that to work through. I think Bennett is going to have to gain the confidence of the Israeli people because, like you said, it wasn't a majority kind of election that produced him, but finagling with the coalition parties that did. So it's going to take time for them to get off the ground, to get to know each other, to figure out who's going to run what ministry in what way. If you take a look at the ministers that have been appointed now to take charge of various arms of the government, it's really going to be interesting to see because, again, we have a lot of different parties represented, a lot of different sympathies represented there. Just for an example of one that's really important to us, the Messianic Jewish community in Israel is who controls the immigration authority. And it was in the hands of the Shas party, which hated us and didn't do anything to help immigrants who might be under our umbrella, so to speak.
And the Shas party, that they are what we call ultra-Orthodox or the Haredi, correct?
They're Sephardic Orthodox, yes.
Okay, ultra-Orthodox wouldn't be the right term?
No.
Oh, okay.
Sephardic Orthodox would be. And
but very, very antagonistic towards Jewish believers in Yeshua.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And so is there
Well,
ahead.
actually, they're pretty antagonistic toward anybody who doesn't think the way they do. And that would
Okay.
include us. We're not the only ones.
All right.
They're not
That's an important point.
And it is with a lot of kind of partisan politics that we have here. Actually, parties are fairly closed in terms of their tolerance of other parties. So it takes a lot of work to build relationship here within the political structure, and for people to work together. It really does.
Can this coalition last, or are you going to go into another election really soon? What do you think?
Well, that's the question. My opinion, it can last if Bennett begins to gain the confidence of other politicians as well as his party. And that's the question, if he'll be able to do that. I don't know. I mean, I hope it does. Even though, obviously, our party ran against Bennett. Another election costs so much money and time and energy, and there'd have to be a large-scale failure for the government to operate well in order to bring about another government, and that's just not good for the country or people. So I do hope that they can.
Are you concerned for this? Are you concerned about the state of security because of this current government?
It's not the government per se. I'll tell you what my concern is. You mentioned David and Goliath before. Let's take a look at reality. Israel, a nation of 9 million people, 7 million of us are Jewish, are surrounded by over 350 million people whose governments believe we don't have a right to exist as a free and independent Jewish state. Now that's David and Goliath right there. You do have nations.
I'm going to stop. I need to stop you right there. And I hope this doesn't take us down a, because this could take time. Didn't Israel just sign some peace agreements with some of those countries?
With the United Arab Emirates, yes. And with Bahrain, yes. And with the Sudan. But if you take their populations off that 350 million, it doesn't dent it very much.
So you're saying it's a drop. These are drops in the bucket.
In terms of the population, yes.
Okay.
But in terms of government power, I mean, you have the state of Iran, which isn't Arab, it's Iranian, but you have the state of Iran pledged to destroy our state. And if they get nuclear weapons, which they're advancing towards very quickly, I have no doubt they'll try to use them against us if they can. And so given that situation, Iran has, 70-some million people, if not more. We really end up being the David. 150,000 rockets in southern Lebanon are aimed at Israel. 150,000. We just took a barrage of 4,000, and it caused a lot of chaos. 150,000 that Iran's proxy army, Hezbollah, put there, and are being trained and helped by Iran and Russia to operate them. And so that, again, adds to the David and Goliath kind of thing that goes through my mind, because Israel really is the David. I mean, it's kind of a vile way to use that image, using it against Israel and claiming that we're Goliath, given the historical roots of the story. But anyhow, that's the reality. And it does make me concerned. I mean, Alan, my grandchildren are growing up in the Middle East that's increasingly intolerant toward Israel. And so what is their future going to look like? Okay, granted, I think the Bible, the Torah, paints a picture of things in the end that are going to, Israel is never going to fall per se as a people. But, the constant bleeding that goes on, the constant tension that we're under, I don't see that necessarily getting better at all. Because we have a big situation in our hands with Iran, and with Hezbollah and those 150,000 rockets, and with Hamas on our western border. We're going to have to find a solution and a conclusion to those three situations. And then you have the Soviets. Whoops, I'm sorry, that was a Freudian slip. You have the Russians under President Putin, just 70 kilometers from our border with their military. So, to quote a neighbor of mine, the future doesn't always look that rosy in terms of natural things.
Is there anything that we who live outside the land and the region can be doing?
Well, certainly those who are Christians and are believers can pray for the state of Israel. We certainly need that. And the entire state of Israel, all Jews included, welcome the prayers of the Christian world for our protection. That would be one. Secondly, talking to your neighbors, if they're interested in what's going on in the Middle East, can really open their eyes, because I'm sure they're not able to get the other side of the story per se, because the media has become so biased, I think. By the way, I used to work in the Army spokesman's unit, so I'm familiar with how the media can take things and twist them in a way that doesn't necessarily give an accurate picture of what really is going on.
So let this be my last question then. Can you recommend any good sources of information that people could help themselves to and share with others?
Yes, the Camera website, just Camera, is a really good site that does great essays, etc., for people. There's another one called Memri, MEMRI.
Okay, so is Camera spelled camera?
Yes, Camera.
I'll look it up, and I'll put the link in the description.
Sure. Memri, MEMRI, is a really good one. The Palestinian Media Watch, or PMW, is another great website. Even the Jerusalem Post website, if you're going to read the Israeli press, the Jerusalem Post for English readers. Yeah, I know. My wife is commenting that the new editor of it is rather a departure from what the Post used to be. But generally speaking, I think they cover events as they really do happen. If you don't get too caught up in their new editor's editorials. So those sites are good ones.
So Joel Rosenberg started this All Israel News. Have you checked that out?
I have. And Joel also would be a recommended source. Yes.
Okay. So I'll put that in as well. Any others?
Absolutely.
No, so any other?
Those are the ones that come to mind right now.
Okay, that's great. So like I said, I will share those in the description. And I really appreciate...
By the way, the IDF has a...
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, no, you take it away.
Oh, okay. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces website, is actually very good at explaining things as well.
So, but didn't you just say that you can't... I thought you said you can't necessarily trust what comes out. Like, did I get confused? You said you were involved as an Army... the spokesman thing a moment ago?
Oh, I wasn't talking about Israel's media. I'm talking about the foreign media here. So in other words, one of my jobs when I was in the military was to pass on information of what was going on here to, say, an Italian journalist. And sometimes when you look and see at the coverage you got from the information that you shared with them, it didn't come out the way I would read the article.
Okay.
So I'm talking about foreign journalists.
All right. Yeah. So there's the IDF website, their Facebook page, Instagram. I've been really impressed with some of their posts. I would imagine for people who've already been convinced of what the mainstream media is saying, they would view some of the positive posts as a form of propaganda. But we can encourage people, do your own research, get to the bottom of these stories.
Exactly.
Yeah. And please, folks,
I think that's really good, Alan. Yep.
Yeah. And folks, if you have any questions for David, we talked earlier, send them to me and I'll pass them on to him. The purpose of this podcast, I know David's heart is the same. I hope you were able to hear it, that we want to portray the truth, and there really is a truth that we could get to, and we want to see God's blessing on all peoples in Israel and the region, the whole Middle East. We want to see true justice and true equity, fairness for all people. And there are so many people that are working towards these things, and this is what we want to encourage. So be sure to check out all the information from the beginning of the podcast and David Friedman's books in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe and do all those good things. Next week, I'm going to be replaying my interview with my daughter, Devorah Stacy, as she came on to speak about pro-life, which my impression is a really misunderstood subject from all sides. So you don't want to miss that, especially if you haven't seen it yet. And so until next time, this is Alan Gilman with Thinking Biblically.